Ana Clarissa Rojas Durazo, we were never meant to survive fighting violence against women, and the Fourth World War on January 1st, 1994, the Zapatistas launched their insurgency in Mexico. The date signified opposition to NAFTA, one of the greatest neoliberal projects, set to commence that day. Globalization policies like NAFTA deem expendable the life and lands of indigenous peoples. This is why, in 1997, Subcommandant Marcos declared in an article in Le Monde that the Fourth World War has already begun. Following the Cold War, which Marcos refers to as the Third World War, the Fourth World War doles out violence and intimidation in dollars. In market bombs point to the Fourth World War is where the logic organization and violence of the market is deployed in always increasing disbursements to all corners of the world and to all aspects of life. Violence, in all its myriad manifestations, economic, environmental, militarized borders and wars of terror, attacks on language and culture, and more, is deemed a natural phenomenon by imperial and corporate powers. Like the sun, the market also rises, and money is naturalized as that neutral ingredient which makes the world go round. The same is true of our social movements, which, like many of us, took the bait hook, line, and sinker. The non-profit industrial complex emerges from these processes of privatization and globalization, and the non-profitization of our social movements is wielded as a weapon in the Fourth World War. How did it happen? How did our movements come to look the way they look? Is the way we work, the way we prioritize and engage in social change reflective of the change we're seeking? What kinds of communities and societies are our current social movements creating? Is the daily minutiae of our work consistent with our vision for a more just and peaceful reality? Who do we name as allies in our work? What is our accountability to each other? And do our partners share our commitment to ending violence against women? And what's money got to do with it? In our efforts to fight violence against women, have we become complicit partners in the Fourth World War? 114. The revolution will not be funded. Let me tell you about the sinker. After over 10 years in the anti-violence movement, I reflect in awe at the courage and leadership of so many sisters across the generations who have given and continue to give of their hearts to create more just and peaceful communities, to stand in solidarity with a sister going through it in the middle of the night. My work humbly rests on the strategies for survival unearthed by many who call out violence against women, insisting on dignity and humanity for all. In that spirit of calling out, I recall a few moments when I witnessed the movement sinking, when I noticed that our practices had become inconsistent with our vision, when we were usurped by capitalism and the state and became complicit with the violence of racism and violence against women. These sinking the movement moments speak specifically to how funding steered our labors toward reproducing instead of eliminating violence against women. 1995. While working in the Latina program at the Support Network for Battered Women, I learned that an immigrant Latina has been brutally beaten by La Migra. I approached the executive director with an op-ed I wrote on behalf of the program that speaks out against all forms of violence against Latinas, including both domestic violence and anti-immigrant state violence. She tells me the board would never allow such an opinion to represent the organization because it is not allowed to take a political stance, and this is clearly a political issue. 1997. After a racist and professionalist takeover of La Casa de las Madres, the new white managerial and directorial staff explicitly hire with a bias towards specialized and licensed degrees, while queer and immigrant Latinos are targeted for harassment. Many of us gather at a forum in New College, in San Francisco, where we tell our stories and critically assess the professionalization of the domestic violence movement and the increasing divide between social work and social justice. 1998. An attempt to rule out bilingual education is underway with the UN's initiative in California, a measure that would seriously impede Latinx access to education and employment. I work with Sor Juana Inés, Services for Abused Women, a Latina organization assisting predominantly Latina survivors and their families. While exploring ways that Sor Juana can take a stance, I am reminded at a meeting of the state's maternal and child health funders that agencies will risk losing their funding if they take a political stance. I go back and read the bylaws and find that upon accepting funding, agencies forfeit their right to take a stance on political matters, especially those pertaining to elections. 2005, after facing over a year of threats to its very existence, not to mention threats directed at staff, San Francisco Women Against Rape loses most of its city funding as well as some foundation money. Many point to the harassment and loss of funding as a Zionist response to the organization's stated position against Israeli-imposed colonial violence and sexual violence against Palestinian women. Let's take a closer look at how these moments reflect the sinking of the movement, diverting our work toward a project that colludes with violence against women. 5 Anti-violence organizations reproduce racist violence against women. In the first case scenario, we note the existence of a Latina program. Now a staple in many anti-violence programs, ethnic or race-specific specialty programs exist within a larger general operation. Embedded within this organizational strategy is an assumption of universal whiteness. Within many anti-violence organizations, the distribution of resources is consistent with the racial disparities that shape this process in the larger society. More often than not, the programs serving communities of color within larger organizations receive the smallest share of their organization's economic resources. Since most anti-violence organizations have become hierarchically ordered, decision-making power is another significant resource that is doled out unequally. Although this arrangement seems inconsistent with organizational objectives to foster and promote relationships in which power is shared equally and not abusively, it nonetheless perseveres, and, again, inequality manifests itself across racial lines. The existence of special and non-white programs emerges from the logic of the liberalist project of multiculturalism. While there are clear racial hierarchies structured into organizations, these programs are developed under a multiculturalist model that renders race marginal by heralding the primacy of culture. Multiculturalist ideology is a remnant of early 20th century modes of studying ethnicity, which were modeled on the experiences of white European immigrants who, through processes of assimilation and acculturation to dominant culture, became new white Americans. Although this model is mute on the issue of race silence, which is part and parcel to the project of whiteness, it often conflates the experiences of communities of color with the experiences of white European immigrants. Thus, culture becomes the dominant framework in establishing support to communities of color, yielding the institutionalization of culturally competent services across domestic violence organizations. Cultural competence models also falsely assume that culture is fixed and static, often dismissing great heterogeneity and inequalities internal to a particular nation, race, or ethnicity. While culturally specific services and programs might appear to address the injuries of racism, this organizational strategy actually displaces race from the broader analysis, effectively ignoring the power structure of white supremacy and the structured subjugation of people of color, which affects countless forms of violence against women. By adding a program ostensibly designed to serve the needs of a given community of color, the larger organization avoids direct accountability to that community. In other words, the organization's own countless forms of violence against women perpetuated by racism. Further, as this example illustrates, the larger organization's white supremacy clearly shapes all its work, programming, and decision-making, including its specific projects. Certainly, institutional white supremacy dictated the work of the Latina program, with the support network for battered women taking a position that silently supported state racist violence against Latinas by muzzling an attempt to publicly denounce it. Thus, culturally competent and/or multicultural organizational structures collude with white supremacy and violence against women of color, namely because this logic enables organizations to dismiss the centrality of racism in all institutions and organizations in the United States. These structures also help protect the state, whose Department of Justice was at once responsible for the brutal beating of a Latina immigrant and the funding of several staff positions and programs at the support network for battered women, including my own. 6. Conversely, this funding relationship encourages the organization to privilege its own fiscal well-being above all else, including the imperative to challenge state violence against women. Here, as the Sor Juana Inés example affirms, we see the paradoxical depoliticization of movements to end violence against women, an insidious process which obscures and protects the tyrannies of the state while diverting these movements' energies away from projects of resistance. The non-profitization of the anti-violence movement in her speech at the 2004 conference The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, veteran anti-violence activist Suzanne Farr pointed to the significant injuries progressive social movements incurred through McCarthyism, COINTELPRO, and as an effect of establishing an alliance with the state by joining the nonprofit sector. At first, she said, women doing anti-violence work sought tax-exempt status for shelters. But the price of achieving nonprofit status became obvious early on as organizers were taunted with lesbian baiting and misogynist jokes, and as funders demanded of the institution certain policies and practices, including professionalization. Soon funders were expressing their preference for degree-bearing professionals instead of community organizers. Organizations were expected to have hierarchical structures, and therapeutic social services were funded over popular education work. Ideologically, violence against women became more and more a behavioral, criminal, and medical phenomenon rather than a social justice issue. When violence against women is understood this way, interventions and attempts at prevention are overly reliant on therapy, and the courts all individualized methods of intervention that fail to address and combat the social organization of violence against women. These methods are also inextricable from institutional arrangements that carry steep histories of racism, like the medical-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex. As a result, the revictimization of women of color becomes more likely. 7 Ronald Reagan, a key player in the emergence of the Fourth World War, made massive attempts to extend privatization to social movements and academia. 8 Through the non-profitization of social movements, a non-profit organization's economic structure, survival, and identity became a dominant aspect of the organization. Ideologically, and in practice through the strict regulation of finances, the rest of the organization's work is understood as a consequence or byproduct of the funding. As organizations became non-profitized, they began to lose political autonomy, and their sense of accountability shifted from their constituents to their funders. The movement was literally split in two when funding came in to work discreetly on either domestic violence or sexual assault, but not both, as if they were so neatly divisible and mutually exclusive. Moreover, executive directors and managers are often given tyrannical say and power while hierarchies are entrenched, usually in line with social axes of inequality such as class, race, nationality, sexuality, and ability. The growing heterosexist and racist harassment pointed to this entrenchment at La Casa de las Madres, and the INS incident at the support network confirmed the tangible power inequality. Ironically, it appears that our corporate-modeled hierarchical organizational structures are actually reproducing the same cycle of violence we seek to eliminate. Let me tell you about the line. Through funding and non-profitization, the movement was called into sleep with the enemy, the U.S. state, the central organizer of violence against women in the world. In an effort to maim the movement, the state made its interests seem compatible with the interests of women. As Patricia Hill Collins observes, domination operates not only by structuring power from the top down, but by simultaneously annexing the power as energy of those on the bottom for its own ends. 10 Through policy, ideology, and the NPIC, the state began to break into pieces the radical social justice agenda of the 118, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded movement against violence against women. First, by prohibiting nonprofits from engaging in politics, it separated interpersonal violence against women from state-based, economic, and institutional violence against women. This individualization of violence excluded the experiences of women of color surviving the multiple forms of state violence. Then the state splintered anti-sexual assault work from the movement to end domestic violence, while certain state-based forms of sexual assault were kept out of the discourse of violence against women and sterilization and other population control practices. 12 The production of knowledge consistent with this agenda is a key strategy to get us to buy the line and to further the project of the non-profitization, professionalization, and social servicization of the anti-violence movement while escalating the criminalization and medicalization of violence. Academic research, under attack by academic capitalism and the extension of privatization to academia, has become increasingly dependent on federal and foundation funding. This funding develops a problematic allegiance to the state and foundation capital and steers the production of knowledge toward those ends. It is in this aforementioned context that the history of domestic violence research is produced. Thus, the historical legacy, the trends and directions in the literature on domestic violence, for example, reflects the trends and directions of the sinking movement, insofar as they follow the subterfuge of the state's ideology on violence against women. The state's line on the criminalization of domestic violence in a move to align itself alongside the anti-violence movement, the state increasingly came to structure violence as a crime. This ideology naturalized violence as a crime, and thus emerged normative contemporary vernacular on violent crimes and hate crimes that conflates violence with crime. Violence is not naturally a crime, yet the interests of a state and the economy are served when violence becomes a crime. 13 The criminalization of domestic violence created a dual advantage for the state. The perpetrator became the sole party responsible for violence against women, while the state positioned itself against the perpetrator and thereby as an ally of battered women. Criminalization also buttressed the state's claim that prisons were the solution to domestic violence, a framework that has been proven to the contrary while yielding disastrous results for women of color and their communities. 14 Interestingly, this development closely parallels the growth of the prison industrial complex and the heightened criminalization of domestic violence through mandatory arrest policies, development of new crime legislation, and steepening sentences for existing crimes. Federal funding to address violence against women was a key strategy to align the anti-violence movement with the criminalization project. In 1976, the Center for Women Policy Studies received a grant from the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the first federal monies made available to address domestic violence. The center published Response, a newsletter intended to reach a national audience with the hope of fostering support for the funding's objective, the criminalization of domestic violence, specifically by improving criminal prosecution rates. 15 Through this newsletter and funding, the interests of the criminal justice system and the battered women's movement were made to look compatible, and domestic violence came to be seen increasingly both within the movement and in larger society as a crime. Federal funding pitched the need for a system-based response to domestic violence, a move that partnered the anti-violence movement with the prison industrial complex, the medical industrial complex, and state social service agencies. The criminalization project ensued, then heightened when two policies that created the largest pools of state funding for anti-violence work became law: the Violence Against Women Act in 1994 and the Violence Against Women Act 2 in 2005. VAWA 1 and 2 merged in policy the interests of the state to criminalize society, populate the cheap labor force of the PIC, manage the nation's shifting racial demographics by quarantining more people of color in prison, and deflect attention from its role in the production and reproduction of domestic violence with the interests of the anti-violence movement. 16 To affirm and structure this merger, VAWA created the U.S. Office on Violence Against Women and housed it in the Department of Justice, the federal arm of the PIC. Thus, federal funding has entrenched the ideology of the criminalization of violence against women, doling out the line inside billions of dollars of funding. One of the dangerous effects of the criminalization process is that it has inhibited grassroots organizing and creative community thinking about real solutions to domestic violence. Instead, the now naturalized response to domestic violence is to call the cops, a tactic that doesn't work too well for communities already under attack by the racism of law enforcement, immigration laws and enforcement, and the prison industrial complex. Additionally, mandatory arrest laws, which are pervasive throughout the country, require an arrest be made if there is a domestic violence call. But rather than protecting women against domestic violence, these policies often re-victimize the survivor by either leading to her arrest or to the arrest of the abuser without survivor consent. In 2004, Incite, Women of Color Against Violence and Critical Resistance released a joint statement regarding the criminalization of domestic violence that revealed the state's true colors. As an overall strategy for ending violence, criminalization has not worked. In fact, the overall impact of mandatory arrest laws for domestic violence has led to decreases in the number of battered women who kill their partners in self-defense, but they have not led to a decrease in the number of batterers who kill their partners. Thus, the law protects batterers more than it protects survivors. The state's line on the medicalization of violence against women, the Western medical model of disease, deflects political causation and individualizes the origin of the problem illness. Likewise, the medical-industrial complex, yet another partnering of a state and capital, co-opts social justice issues by taking them under its jurisdiction. Point 18, through policies such as health practitioner mandatory reporting policies, the MIC interfaces with the PIC to support state and economic interests in the criminalization of violence against women. For instance, these policies require that healthcare providers report suspected abuse to law enforcement. But survivor advocates argue that mandatory reporting policies disregard survivors' choice to contact law enforcement, and in the process they are re-victimized with the increased danger of being arrested or deported. Point 19, the MIC and PIC are principally interested in promoting profit, often at the expense and victimization of the most marginalized members of society, such as women of color. Just as the criminalization of violence against women emerged alongside the growth of the PIC, the medicalization of violence against women is closely linked to the growing privatization and corporatization of healthcare. The criminalization and medicalization of violence against women intersect in that they promote an agenda to depoliticize the movement. The racist, corporate, and hierarchical organizational structures of the MIC and the PIC are extended to social movements, and more, the anti-violence movement mirrors these violent organizational structures. Private and public funding that encourage, or require, a system-based response coerce anti-violence organizations to work alongside these industrial complexes by extending the criminalization and medicalization of violence against women. Calling out the anti-violence state, as argued earlier, the state used funding as a strategy to ally itself with the anti-violence movement while diverting our attention from state violence. But our efforts to fight violence against women must account for the ways the state deploys violence. We cannot plan and create just and peaceful realities without calling out the state that deceptively positions itself as the anti-violence state. As Angela Davis poignantly argued in her opening address at the first Color of Violence conference, violence is constituted in the very fabric of society. Point 20, in no way an unexpected aberration in the order of things. Violence is the knife that cuts, and the thread that sews this racist imperial nation together. Violence is the order of things. It creates and separates nation-states, slices us into genders and sexes, global north and south, distances the suburbs from the inner cities, brown and black from white. Point 21, indeed, unequal and oppressive social arrangements are engendered through acts of violence. Point 22, it takes violence to breed injustice. It takes violence to keep injustice. The specific contours of violence today glare with a neo-colonial empire-building agenda that has conjured the war of terror, the 21st century invention of an ideological weapon wielded to maneuver public consent for abhorred attacks on humanity. It has been estimated that more than 100,000 Iraqi civilians were killed in just the first 18 months of military occupation. This, in addition to the many more hundreds of thousands killed through economic sanctions and the Gulf War invasion in 1991.23, all expressions of violence are interconnected, and physical and military violence require ideological violence for legitimation and to enlist our participation. A war could not be without acquiescence to the logic of war. The U.S.-Mexico border reminds us that mass rapes, the mutilation of bodies, and murder have been integral ingredients in the concoction of neo-colonial, neoliberal relations of Fourth World War. The Juarez femicides, and the entire continuum of violence against Mexicanos and other migrants follow the violent incision of an increasingly militarized U.S.-Mexico border into these lands and peoples. 24 violence is an attempt to mark domination. Paulo Freire argued that violence is a tactic in the pursuit of power, a tool of domination that is centrally deployed by the state. Point 25, this is consistent with the work of Yvette Flores Ortiz and Antonia Castañeda, who trace the foundational acts of domination in the United States acts of conquest and colonial violence against Native women and Black women. Point 26, where violence is the constant and the context, multiple forms of violence are co-constituted, carried out in an organized manner that drives the mission of empire and its hues of a heteronormative, white supremacist patriarchal capitalist order. Domestic violence is a manifestation of unequal, or the pursuit of unequal, intimate relationships, and it emerges from, and within a social context marked by inequality and the pursuit of inequality. 27 The state cites the exclusive primacy of gender oppression in its ideology on domestic violence. This emphasis is dangerous, as it obscures how other central social processes such as race and class are implicated in the production of domestic violence, not just as effects but as constructive forces. For example, the feminization and racialization of poverty don't just create additional barriers for poor survivors of domestic violence who 122, the revolution will not be funded are women of color. These social processes are actually constitutive elements in domestic violence. Violence itself, as Angela Davis also noted, is a powerful ideological conductor whose meaning constantly mutates. 28 Discourses of violence are situated and produced amid specific political and historical interests and contexts. So it is compelling to note that the state has ushered in what have become dominant narratives on violence against women that do not consider the intersection of state and interpersonal violence. 29 Anti-violence groups who do consider this intersection, such as San Francisco Women Against Rape, are considered a threat and have had to endure organized attacks. When the state defines violence against women, it excludes from the definition among the most egregious attacks in the history of the human experience, dismissing many experiences of colonial and racist violence. In fact, the state narrative on violence against women excludes just about every form of violence, including military violence. 30 When we ask the question, what counts as violence against women, we come to find that the state's narrative not only fails to consider the experiences of women of color, but it also fails to represent the scope of violence against us. In doing so, it ignores the roots of domestic violence, therefore missing any opportunity to arrive at real solutions. Through the criminalization process, the state also produces a racist, sexist, and heteronormative discourse on violence that works to purport men of color as hyperviolent, legitimating the racist practice of containing, detaining, invading, criminalizing, and splitting people of color communities. 31 The ideological work of a hegemonic discourse on violence against women that avoids many other prevalent forms of violence, particularly those experienced by women of color in our communities, sets up a pretense to address violence while simultaneously protecting white supremacist, patriarchal, and capitalist social arrangements. This analysis begins to reveal not only the state's complicity in maintaining violence against women, but the state's interest in deploying violence against women. This is the state's double discourse on violence against women, expressing interest in care, definition, and intervention of certain forms of violence on one hand, while dismissing, negating, and deploying other forms of violence. 32 In practice, the state legitimates violence as legal, excluding its own practices from the very nomenclature of violence. 33 Violence is defined as separate, even oppositional to the state, in order to evade accountability. During the civil rights era, the state's concern with the threatening rise of social movements reinvigorated its interest in violence. In direct response to that summer's urban riots, in 1967 the federal government commissioned the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, which established a link between civil disorder and violence. A year later, the first federally appointed body to ascertain the problem we were never meant to survive, 123 of violence in the U.S., the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence was born. The commission was given the following tasks: to investigate and make recommendations with respect to the causes and prevention of lawless acts of violence in our society, including assassination, murder, and assault, and the causes and prevention of disrespect for law and order, of disrespect for public officials, and of violent disruptions of public order by individuals and groups. 15 This ideological maneuvering positions violence outside the jurisdiction of a state as lawlessness. From this, it seems clear that the Commission's assigned task was to quell popular uprising which could potentially pose a threat to the state by any available measures, particularly the law and order state itself. 36. To that end, this historic panel's work assigned violence to the state's control and tagged myriad resistant activities as criminal. It sets violence as an expression of opposition to the state law, as well as a crime and behavioral issue. The latter two frameworks are rooted in the individual, and with this swift move, the state slips itself out of the realm of violence. Undergirded by this ideological foundation, the social servicization of violence against women is made a dominant feature of the anti-violence movement through funding that effectively discourages social change, a recurring tactic of the NPIC. While the state posits itself as an ally in ending violence against women, the anti-violence movement grows ever more dependent on its funding and ideology. Antonio Gramsci argued that the consent of the ruled is achieved through the state's education of the masses. In other words, the feeding of the line is key to establishing hegemony, the way the dominant group, through culture, folklore, and an array of social institutions, creates what comes to be known as common sense. 37. And through the ideological disbursements and funding, we come to expect prisons, therapists, and medicine to eliminate violence against women. The NPIC has delivered the line. And the hook? Money, money, and more money. The U.S. Office on Violence Against Women diffuses the state's ideology on violence against women through the more than $1 billion of funding it administers each year. The context is key here because the nonprofitization of social movements occurs in a globalizing context in which privatization is extended more and more to all aspects of life, including resistance. In this way, nonprofitization becomes a weapon of the Fourth World War. Everyone, whether an educator, a healthcare worker, or a domestic violence advocate, is working in pseudo-corporate environments where the culture and organization of the market is increasingly encroaching on our lives. Instead of organizers, we have managers and bureaucrats, receptionists and clients. Instead of social change, we have service deliverables, and the vision that once drove our deep commitment to fighting violence against women has been replaced by outcomes. Globalization also sets out to heighten need and dependence on money by impoverishing and crippling economies and then fostering dependence on the institutions and national currencies capable of distributing it. The same is true for social movements that arise out of severe injustice that cripples and impoverishes the marginalized members of society. So in many ways, social movements for justice and liberation are made to need money. To the hungry fish in the sea, the bait on the hook looks real good. But soon enough, the fish learns that the hook ain't worth it, that the bait ain't just a meal after all. Do we take to the hook because we need it? And when do we come to know the hook ain't worth it, and the money ain't worth it because it's actually killing the change we set out to create while signing us up to become complicit partners in the Fourth World War? What will it take to resist the hook, to disinvest from the NPIC? Going global, the McDonaldization of a movement, Subcommandant Marcos asserts. What is to be done when violence derives from the laws of the market? The greatest casualties of the Fourth World War are undoubtedly endured by the most disenfranchised lands, nations, and indigenous peoples in the global South. Movements of resistance and justice also stand among the casualties. Like McDonald's franchises on the global market, movements seeking ideology from the state, nonprofits, and non-governmental organizations is handed out alongside billions of dollars in funding. Globalization extends the logic and organization of the market to all aspects of life. Imperialism extends the state ideology. The two work hand in hand while the criminalization, social servicization, medicalization, and non-profitization of social movements proliferates. Under the guise of transnational feminist projects, many U.S.-based organizations and funders partner with organizations in the global South in their fight against domestic violence. In a move reminiscent of the prior discussion on multiculturalism, institutionalized racism, and cultural competency models, U.S.-based, maimed movement approaches are signed, sealed, and delivered throughout the world, with minor adjustments to protocol and practice based on the cultural and social particulars of the global South partner. Karen Kaplan and Inderpal Gruel reveal that the fallacy of supposed transnational feminist projects lies in their inability to commit to engaging in international and critical analysis and practice that recognizes asymmetries of power and multiple expressions of agency. Point 38 in effect. The imposition of U.S. models of intervention in violence against women dismisses the context of globalization and imperialism, falsely casting the United States as interested in the safety and well-being of women in the Global South. Further, this imposition frames U.S. anti-violence models as superior to all others, jeopardizing the practices, traditions, and epistemologies of indigenous women and communities in the Global South. The anti-globalization movements throughout the world are leading the way in fighting privatization and the Fourth World War. Given that they share the same enemies, what will it take for the anti-globalization movements to ally with the anti-violence movement? First, both movements would have to jointly resist non-profitization, the process which extends privatization to social movements and allies them with profit-seeking interests like the PIC and MIC. And second, both movements would have to jointly articulate and engender visions of social justice and liberation that account for the ways the Fourth World War deploys violence against women and sets out to co-opt the anti-violence movement. Getting there, I was recently riding a taxi in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the driver, a middle-aged man from Mumbai, India, commented that we should always be skeptical of research findings in design, and that we should look very closely at who is funding the research. Through funding, they tell you how to think, he said. In 2003, in Delhi, India, Insight met with a grassroots activist group doing work around AIDS. The group refused any money except that raised through grassroots means. We were reminded that money corrupts and always carries strings. Suzanne Farr asked the audience at the Revolution Will Not Be Funded conference, in a time of rapacious capitalism, what might we do to fund a radical movement? Many sisters are leading the way, disinvesting from the NPIC, disinvesting from the state, and redirecting energies and precious resources and time to grassroots organizing, political education, and community mobilization. As I write this article, Sista Tu Sista is de 501izing 39 Insight still refuses to incorporate as a nonprofit, and we remember the rejection by the cap of $600,000 from the Department of Justice, the federal agency that refused the group's references to lesbian battering, racism, and commitment to organizing. In spite of the dismal landscape, we persevere with fierce and strong determination as more radical and grassroots movements against violence against women are born. These movements insist on recognizing all forms of violence against women, including state and racist violence. More interested in ending violence against women than in winning the largest grant, pandering to funders, or worrying over government regulations, we are reminded to take a close look and notice what path we're headed down. This is a call to remember why funding takes the directions it takes, why some things get funded and others don't, and what we become complicit in by pursuing and accepting certain funds. Funding, whether government or foundation money, emerges from the deepest ravages of capitalist inequality. Simply put, the government will not dole out dollars to organize against privatization, against the Fourth World War, or against itself. In other words, it will not fund the movement to end violence against women. Paulo Freire once said that violence is an instrument of terror intended to immobilize the opponent. It stands then that the non-profit industrial complex is guilty of deploying the violence of non-profitization, an attempt to sink our movements. And just as we have always done, we will not stand for violence. We will call out injustice wherever we see it and continue our long, hopeful fight to end violence against women and the Fourth World War. Notes the title of this essay is inspired by Audre Lorde, who wrote, "For to survive in the mouth of the dragon we call America, we have had to learn this first and most vital lesson that we were never meant to survive." Audre Lorde, Sister Outsider. 1 Subcommandant Marcos. Why we are fighting. The Fourth World War has begun. Le Monde Diplomatique, September 1997. 2 Subcommandant Marcos. The Fourth World War has begun. In the Zapatista Reader, edition Tom Hayden, 270 to 275. 3. For further discussion of the intersection of the violence of racism and violence against women, see the work of Antonia Castañeda and Yvette Flores Ortiz and Insight. Women of Color Against Violence, edition, Color of Violence, The Insight. Anthology. For further discussion on Zionism, Please see Color of Violence, specifically Nadine Neighbor, Iman Disuki, and Lena Baruti's The Forgottenism, an Arab American women's perspective on Zionism, racism, and sexism, and Nadine Neighbor's A Call for Consistency, Palestinian Resistance and Radical U.S. Women of Color. 5. My observations stem from my own direct personal experience working in the movement and the emergent patterns noted from countless conversations and statewide and national meetings. These formations are not present in every organization. Rather, such organizational structures have become dominant and mainstream within the anti-violence movement as a whole. 6. Violence against women funding is administered through the Department of Justice, which, up until the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, also housed and administered immigration enforcement. 7. Beth E. Ritchie, Compelled to Crime. The E. York, Routledge 1,